How you doing, eh? Welcome back to Babylon. Tom, today we're starting Daf Mem Beis, Daf 42 of masechta Avodah Zarah. Friends, friends. Today we continue the discussion that we began yesterday about the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Laqish regarding Avodah Zarah shenishtaber me'eleh. When you have avod, like actual Avodah Zarah, not just an idol that maybe was worshipped, maybe wasn't, like actual Avodah Zarah that broke. Rabbi Yochanan's opinion is that it remains Avodah Zarah, it remains osir. Resh Lakish's opinion is that no way, that's the lamest Avodah Zarah that there ever was. Avodah Zarah that couldn't even keep itself in one piece, how is it going to keep its worshippers in one piece? So Resh Laqish says that you can safely assume that any broken Avodah Zarah is no longer being worshipped. We are now in the middle of that machlokes, going back and forth. Rabbi Yochanan trying to disprove Resh Laqish trying to disprove Rabbi Yochanan. That's where we are right now. So we're going to jump into there. Towards the end of today's daf, we are going to arrive at our next mishnah, talking about different vessels that have different kinds of pictures and things on them and their status vis-a-vis Avodah Zarah. So here we go. I hope you will enjoy Daf Mem Beis of masechta Avodah Zarah. Okay, we're going to begin on Daf Mem Beis Amud Aleph of masechta Avodah Zarah, about 10 or 15 lines into the Amud where it says Esvei. You got it? Good. It's the middle word on the line. Esvei. So Rabbi Yochanan asks a kasha on Resh Laqish. Motza tabnis yad, tabnis rogel, hare elu asurin, mipnei shekayotze boen ne'evod. So Rabbi Yochanan asks a kasha on Resh Laqish. He says, look, our mishnah says that if you find a hand or a leg from Avodah Zarah, well, really our mishnah was talking about it selling, but of an idol. But anyways, if you find a hand or a leg, well then it is also, I guess if this applies to an idol, then certainly it would apply to Avodah Zarah as well, right? I think that Kal V'chomer makes sense. If even an idol, you only have part of it and it's osir, so then certainly, if this were the case by Avodah Zarah, it should certainly be osir. So Resh Laqish, how do you explain that? I would imagine, Resh Laqish, that if it's broken, it should be permitted. Right, just the hand, just the foot. So, amai ashvarnenu, these are broken pieces. They should be permitted, according to you, Resh Laqish. Yeah, but Resh Laqish says, meh, old news. Shmuel was already asked that question, and he already answered it. That it's only osir when they are on some kind of a pedestal of sorts. There's machlokes Rashi and Tosfos that we talked about yesterday about is it exactly on a pedestal per se or just some kind of self-standing construction of sorts. But whatever it is, it's specifically in that scenario that it would be also, but otherwise, argues Resh Laqish, it would be considered broken and mutter. Esvei, Rabbi Yochanan asks another kasha on Resh Laqish. An Oived Kechavim could be mevatel his Avodah Zarah. How could one be mevatel Avodah Zarah? Easy, break it. Break it. You have some kind of idol, right? Oived Kechavim has an idol that he's worshipping as a deity. So he breaks it, and that's it. It's broken, it's useless, it's no longer Avodah Zarah. And he can do this not only for his idols, but for his colleagues, for his friends' idols as well, right? He says, Avodas Kechavim, right? Oived Kechavim mevatel Avodas Kechavim shelo v'shel chaver. And Oived Kechavim can be mevatel his own Avodah Zarah as well as his fellows' Avodah Zarah. V'Yisrael, but a Yid, eino mevatel Avodas Kechavim shel Oived Kechavim. However, a Yid cannot be mevatel the Avodah Zarah of an Oived Kechavim. But amai, why not? Interesting kasha. Resh Laqish, what was your rationale? What was your explanation for why Avodah Zarah shenishtab meileh is mutter? Because as we discussed a minute ago, if the Avodah Zarah can't even protect itself, how is it supposed to protect me? So shouldn't you be able to make that same argument here? On the one hand, we're saying that a Yid who breaks the Avodah Zarah of an Ovid Kechavim, we're saying it's not bottle. But I would think, based on that argument, Resh Laqish, based on your argument, that it should be bottle. If the Avodah Zarah was unable to defend itself from this Yid, how could you trust Avodah Zarah to defend its worshippers? And therefore, Rabbi Yochanan asked Resh Laqish that based on his theory, it would make sense, it would be logical to conclude that a Yid who breaks the Avodah Zarah of an Ovid Kechavim, it should be considered bottle. So Rabbi says, Rabbi says, well, that's talking about a scenario where he didn't quite break it, he just kind of shifted its mass somewhat. Meaning he took some kind of a knocker of sorts and gave the Avodah Zarah a knock. Now, it's not like he knocked off his nose or something like that, just maybe he knocked in the nose and now he has bigger ears or something like that. And in that case, the Avodah Zarah would not be considered bottle because fakert. The Ovid Kechavim will say, wow, my Avodah Zarah, he is such a great Avodah Zarah that he doesn't even mind when somebody knocks in his nose. That's what he's going to say. He's rachum v'chanun. He even allows, he's noisei al boinoi v'loi, what's it called? He accepts his disgrace and he doesn't respond. Vayider maharun la'avdil al-fafi avdol v'vavavas. Some Rabbi says the reason why the Avodah Zarah is not bottle when the Yid breaks it is because it's not talking about where he actually breaks it, but he just kind of shifted its mass, knocked in its nose, gave it bigger ears. V'chi prosa mai have v'atnan prosa afapi shel chasha botla. But who cares? I mean, the Mishnah says, v'chi prosa mai have v'atnan, we learn in a Mishnah. Where's this Mishnah? Andaf nun gimel. That prosa afagav shel chasha bot, that knocking in its nose and giving it bigger ears is also a form of bittul. So therefore, for the Gemara, who cares if he knocked off his nose or knocked in his nose? Either way, it should be bottle. But that would it's only bottle when it's an Ovid Kechavim who knocks in the shnaz. Aval prosa Yisrael, but if it's a Yid who knocks in the shnaz, lo batla, then the Avodah Zarah is not bottle. Because as I said a minute ago, it'll have the opposite effect that, wow, this Avodah Zarah is such a rachum v'chanun. I can't remember that phrase though. Whatever. That he hears is they're putting him down and he's just quiet. Okay. V'Ravi Omar, whereas Ravi says, L'olam kipchasu yisrael nami botlo, that says Ravi that actually if a Yid were to knock in the shnaz of in Avodah Zarah, it would, technically speaking, be batal. However, ele gezerah dilma magbala v'hoder mavtil law v'avi avodas kachavim b'yad Yisrael v'chavodas kachavim b'yad Yisrael in a betela la'olam. Says Rave, look, in principle, yes, if knocking in the shnaz is knocking in the shnaz, makes no difference if it's the Ovid Kechavim who knocks it in or a Yid who knocks it in. So it says Rava, yes, in principle, a Yid who knocks in the shnaz of an Avodah Zarah, it's also going to be bottle. However, the reason why we say it's not bottle is out of a concern. It's a gezerah d'Rabbanan. What's the gezerah d'Rabbanan? The gezerah d'Rabbanan is that we're concerned that maybe before he gave it the knack, he picked it up first. And he was kind of bad bo, and he was kind of Avodah Zarah, in which case it was his getchke technically that he knocked in, and any Avodah Zarah belonging to a Yid can never be bottled. And that's the concern, says Rava. The concern is that maybe he picked it up before knocking in the shnaz, and which makes it his, the yid's, and Avodah Zarah belonging to a yid can never be bottled. So let's do that again. Rava Amar says, Rava, le'olam ki pchoso Yisrael nami botla, that if a yid knocks in the shnaz of the Avodah Zarah, it's also bottle. However, the reason why we say it's not bottle is exer d'Rabbanan, el exera dilma magbala. Maybe the yid's going to first pick it up, v'adar mavtila, and only then knock in the shnaz, bavi avodas kechavim biyad Yisrael, and therefore it would be Avodah Zarah. Once the yid picks it up, it would be Avodah biyad Yisrael, v'chol avodas kechavim biyad Yisrael eino b'tele la'olam. And any Avodah Zarah by a yid will never be bottle. Eisvei nocha kasha. Rabbi Yochanan drills Resh Laqish and he asks, Akum shehevi avonim min markulis. An Ovid Kochavim who brought stones from Markulis. We're going to learn more about Markulis. Not sure in which parak, maybe next parak. But Markulis is be'etzem, a type of Avodah Zarah that you would set up a few stones, you'd have a little pile of stones, and you would throw stones at it or something, or add stones to it. We'll get to it in more detail, I think, within the next week or two. So if an Akum took this pile of stones, v'chipa boy and drochim v'tartios, and he used the stones in order to pave roads and paths, mutaros, well then, the Avodah Zarah is bottle. He took the pile of stones and he's now using it as pavement. Okay, he's clearly not worshipping it anymore. So it's mutter, and I guess you could traverse the path. V'Yisrael shevi avonim min markulis, but a yid who brings stones from the markulis v'chipa boin drochim v'tartios, and he paved with them asuris, they are still asuris. So Rabbi Yochanan asks Resh Laqish, how come when a yid paves a road with stones from markulis, it is still asur? Shouldn't it be considered like the markulis is broken and it couldn't defend itself, etc.? It should be mutter. So Hanami kidiravo. So here as well, we'll suggest that, well, you're right, it should be bottle, but we're concerned like Rava that maybe he picked up all the stones first and was kona them, and therefore he's unable to be mevatel them once he's been kona them. So maybe technically they should be bottle, but there's a concern where we're concerned for Rava's concern about maybe he was kona the stones first. Eisvei, another kasha. Oivekuchovim sheshipa avodas kuchovim. So if you have an Ovid Kuchovim who goes to an Asherah tree, and Ovid Kuchovim goes to an Asherah tree, and he gives it a trim. Again, Ovid Kuchovim sheshipa avodas kuchovim litzorko. If he's giving, an Asherah tree is be'etzim a tree that was worshipped for Avodah Zarah. Now this Ovid Kuchovim goes and he's cutting off part of the tree. So if he's cutting it off because he simply needs wood and he's going over to the Asherah tree and he's saying, well, okay, I need wood, I'm cutting you down. Well then, or at least part of you, I'm trimming you because I need wood. Well then, hu v'shipuyeh mutarin. Well then, what the Ovid Kuchovim cuts off of the Asherah, as well as the Asherah itself, they're all permitted because clearly this Ovid Kuchovim doesn't care much about this Asherah tree. He needs wood, he's cutting it down. It's not considered Avodah Zarah any longer, the Tzor Kov. However, if he's trimming the Asherah tree in order to make the Asherah tree more beautiful, well, in that case, he Asura, the Asherah remains Asura. V'shipuyah mutarin, but its trimmings are permitted. But since the trimmings were in order to beautify the Asherah itself, the Asherah remains permitted. Remains Avodah Zarah. V'Yisrael sheshipa avodas kuchovim. Now, if a yid were to do this, bein litzorko, whether the yid was trimming the Asherah tree because he needed wood or because he wanted to beautify the Asherah tree. Either way, he v'shipuya asurin, everything remains forbidden. The trimmings, the Asherah itself, but amai. Why should everything remain forbidden, Resh Laqish? It should be like Avodah Zarah that broke, and we should say that it's mutter. It's also like Rav. I assume that you'd have to be talking about an Asherah tree that is not planted into the ground, because how would you pick that up and be koned? I assume, unless if anybody else has another way of thinking about this that I'm missing, I assume it's probably talking about some tree that's in a pot or something. I imagine. So maybe he picked it up and therefore he can't be mevatel it. This is a mishnah that we're going to get to tomorrow. Okay, we're going to get up to it tomorrow, but I reckon we'll probably learn it in 2 days from now. Says Rabbi Yossi, if you have an Avodah Zarah, an idol, so we had talked about, I think, the mission that we're going to get to today, actually, we are going to talk about taking a idol or some kind of Avodah Zarah and bringing it to the sea and throwing it into the sea and disposing of it that way. Rabbi Yossi suggests that an alternative is to push it, grind it up into powder or whatever, throw it up in the air and let the wind blow it away. Okay? So Rabbi Yossi, Yomi says Rabbi Yossi, shachik v'zorah laruach. Omatil yom. That either he could throw it into the sea, sure, but alternatively, he could take the idol, grind it up into powder, throw it up in the air, and let the wind blow it away. Amrlo, but they responded to Rabbi Yossi, ma pitom, afi naisa zevel. The problem is, if you do that, then the Avodah Zarah, but you took the Avodah Zarah, you ground it up into powder, you threw it up in the air, you let the wind blow it, but the wind is going to blow it onto the field. And the powder is going to fertilize. I don't know if fertilizer really works, I guess, but whatever it is, the assumption is that this powder would be able to benefit the field, and that is going to be a problem because the idol was Avodah Zarah. And the Pasuk says, you can't have anything from the Avodah Zarah. You can't get any benefit from it. So, but Amai, Resh Laqish, what's the problem here? Why are we concerned about fertilizer? You ground it up into powder already. It should be considered like broken Avodah Zarah that should be permitted. What are we concerned about? Here also, like Rav, well, maybe he picked it up first. He was going to a camping battle. Tosfos Darker points out in the Tosfos, Dibur Masel Hachanami Kedirava, B'chol Hani V'Deka, B'chol Tzarich Iyun B'chol Hani V'Dekarilo My Karilo Pshita Delishane Behu Kedirava. Why do we keep on beating a dead horse, so to speak? We keep on example, scenario after scenario of things that are just answered the same way. We're concerned they picked it up first, like Rav. Why do we keep on drilling the same thing over and over? Tosfos says, Tzarich Iyun. Says, I don't know, but we have to look into this matter because it's very strange that we keep on asking questions that are all just answered the same exact way. We're not done yet. Rabbi Yossi ben Yosion, Omer. Rabbi Yossi ben Yosion says, Motzitzuras darkin. If a fellow finds an image of a dragon, virosho chotuch, and its head is amputated, headless, a headless dragon, Safek of it kechavim chatochai, Safek Yisrael chatochai. So long as you don't know who, I don't think amputated is the word I'm thinking of. The word I'm thinking of is decapitated. A decapitated dragon. We don't know if who decapitated the dragon. Was it an Ovid Kochavim who was the decapitator or a Yid? Mutter. So in that case, since the dragon is decapitated, it is mutter. However, Vada Yisrael Chatochu, but if you know for a fact that it's a Yid who is the amputator, Osir, then the dragon remains Osir. But Amai, why should it be Osir? Should be like Avodah Zarah Shnistab Melech, it should be mutter. Hochanami Kidei Rave. Here as well, we are concerned, like Rava says, that maybe he picked it up first, maybe the Yid picked it up first, was Kona it, and therefore it would be impossible to be Mivatal it. Eisve Nochakasha. Rabbi Yossi says, Rabbi Yossi, Ap lo yirokis b'yemos adusham b'nisha nevoyo no sheres alein. I might have a kavod d'chom shnishtav melea. Interesting. So, generally speaking, I'm not a farmer yet, but generally speaking, my understanding from the Gemara is that in the winter, you're not going to want to plant vegetables under a tree, because I imagine you're probably going to want to get as much sunlight as you can, and planting vegetables under the shade of a tree in the wintertime is not desirable. So now what if that tree is an Asherah tree? What if that tree is Avodah Zarah? Can you plant vegetables under an Avodah Zarah tree, under an Asherah tree during the winter? So I think the Chacham say, the Tanakhama say, it's no problem because you're not getting benefit from the tree. It's unideal to plant vegetables under a tree during the wintertime. However, says Rabbi Yossi, let's read it now inside again. Rabbi Yossi, Yomi says Rabbi Yossi, Af lo yirakis b'moisag yishamim. You can't even plant vegetables under an Asherah during the winter because the leaves from the Asherah tree are going to fall onto the vegetables, and it's going to serve as certain compost, a fertilizer. It's going to benefit the vegetables, and therefore you'll be getting benefit from the leaves of the Asherah tree. But Amai, Resh Laqish, basically, the tree is breaking. It's an Asherah tree. It's a Avodah Zarah tree. It's breaking apart onto the vegetables. And it should be permitted. What should be the problem? Getting benefit from a broken Avodah Zarah tree, which should be permitted, according to Shimon and Laqish. So shiny also. Nah, it's different over there. Because the Ikra of it is Kayem is because even though the leaves are falling from the tree, but the tree itself is still there, and therefore everything remains osir. But Vaha Shipuyin, the Ikra of it is Kayem is V'katani L'tzarka, he asur v'shipuya mutarin. But what about, we had a scenario a few minutes ago, you have an Asherah tree, and you're trimming off from the Asherah tree, and we're saying that if you do it in order to beautify the Asherah tree, so the Asherah itself remains osir, but the trimmings are mutter. But if we're saying here by the tree that the leaves fall off and they remain osir because the tree is intact, well then I should, based on that same logic, I would think that by trimming the Asherah tree, the trimmings should also be osir since the main Asherah tree is still there, right? Again, from the top of Vashipuyim, when it comes to trimming the Asherah that we talked about earlier, the Ikra of it is that the main tree is still there. V'katani L'tzarka, that if you are trimming the Asherah tree in order to beautify the Asherah tree, the Asherah remains, the tree, the main tree is still there, it remains asur, v'shipuyah mutarin, but the trimmings are mutter. So based on that same svar, I would think that, based on that logic, I would argue that by the Asherah tree with the leaves falling, the leaves should be mutter, just like the trimmings are mutter. Afuna brei to Yeshua Omar. So says Afuna brei to Yeshua lefisha ein avodas kocham betela derech gedela. So the answer is that Avodah Zarah doesn't become batel in its natural life cycle, right? A tree has part of its natural life cycle. Its leaves shed. They fall. And therefore, if you have an Asherah tree, those leaves that naturally fall off the tree remain also just like the tree itself. However, if a person goes and trims an Asherah tree and actively interferes, I don't think that's the right word, but sort of actively acts upon the Asherah tree, removing trimmings, well, those trimmings will no longer be considered part of the Asherah tree, and in that case, they will be the trimmings will be mutter, even though the Asherah tree itself remains osir. So now, Resh Laqish flips the script on Rabbi Yochanan. And now Resh Laqish asks Rabbi Yochanan, he says, Eitz Rabbi Shimon ben Laqish Rabbi Yochanan, Kain sheberosh ilam. When you have a nest, a bird's nest at the top of a tree, shel hektish, if the tree is hektish, belongs to the Beis HaMikdash, of course you can't get benefit from that tree, from the hektish tree. So in terms of the nest, lo nenin v'lo mo'alin, right? So getting benefit from the hektish tree itself would not be allowed. But in terms of the nest on top of the tree, well, there we say midrabanon, don't get enough from it. But if you do get enough from it, lo mo'alin, there's not going to be an osham mi'ilos, because mida oraisa, the nest is actually okay. Berosha shel asher, and if the bird's nest was built on top of an Asherah tree, Avodah Zarah tree, yatas bakone, take a stick, take a branch, and knock the nest off of the tree, and then you can get benefit from the nest. Just knock the nest off from the top of the tree, and you can get benefit from the nest. So we see that even though the Asherah tree is Avodah Zarah, but when, right, so you have this Asherah tree, but a nest was constructed from it, and we're saying you can get benefit from this nest that was constructed. So it's entering our mind that what's it talking about? It's talking about where, I guess, the birds snapped off some twigs or found some twigs from the tree and constructed this nest with the Asherah tree itself. Vikatoni yatis bekane. We're saying just knock the nest off of the tree, and it's mutter. So we see that a broken Avodah Zarah, that this broken Asherah, is now mutter. So the Gemara answers, the reason why the nest is permitted is because the twigs for the nest did not come from the Asherah tree. They came from who knows where. That's where they came from. They came from who knows where. The birds found some twigs, who knows where, and brought them over. And it made them into a nest. And you can also infer this, because it says in the Resh, when we're talking about a tree that belongs to the Beis HaMikdash, lo nenin v'lo me'alin, that this nest at the top of the hektish tree, mida oraisa, is not hektish. There's no me'ila if you get benefit from it. Lo nenin midrabanan, you don't get benefit, but there's no din me'ila. So I understand if the twigs for the nest came from who knows where. So I need to hanu dikatoni. This is why it says gabi hektish lo nenin v'lo me'alin. This is why by the hektish tree, if you get benefit from the nest, while also midrabanan, there's not going to be a korban me'ila, lo nenin midrabanan v'lo me'alin midoraisa. Midoraisa, there's no me'ila, and there's no osher me'ilas. But midrabanan, we say don't get benefit. And that's talking about where the twigs for the nest came from, who knows where. Dalo kadisha, because they themselves aren't actually hektish. So of course, midoraisa at least, there's no me'ila. Elo yomer shishibra eitzim imenu v'kinsa boyin. But if you say that the twigs for the nest came from the hektish tree itself, amaylo me'alin, why is there no me'ila? It's coming from the hektish tree. Of course, it's hektish. Hakadisha, it's hektish. Of course, there should be me'ila. So ra'elamai, it must be that the twigs came from who knows where, and that's why there's no me'ila. And we want to bring this as a proof to say that the same would be for the Asherah tree, that the twigs came from who knows where, and that's why you could just knock off the nest from the top. To which the Gemara says, this isn't a proof. Right? From the hektish to say that the fact that it's not hektish means that they must have come from some other place. That isn't necessarily true. And you can argue that you can, it's not a definitive proof to say that by the hektish, from the fact there's no me'ila, it must have been that the twigs came from who knows where. No, the twigs could have still actually come from the hektish tree itself. Well, then why are they not hektish? Well, because maybe these are twigs that grew after the tree became hektish. Right? Maybe you makdish the tree. Maybe you said this tree is for the Beis HaMikdash. And then after that proclamation, some branches grew, some twigs grew, and birds used those twigs for their nest. Well, since those branches came after the hektish was hektished, so they could even come from the tree and still be mutter since they came after the fact. So the fact that the midoraisa, there's no me'ilah by the nest, is not necessarily an indication that the twigs came from who knows where. They could have come from the tree itself, so long as they grew after the hektish was hektished. V'kosaver ein me'ilah begedulin, and that the author of this mishnah from me'ilah holds that there's no me'ilah with things that grow. So again, it's not a definitive proof over there that the twigs came from elsewhere. They could have come from the tree itself, just that they grew after the hektish was established. Rabbi Yochanan. Now Rabbi Abba says the name of Yochanan, a different answer. Right? We had just explained, Resh Laqish used this as a kasha against Rabbi Yochanan. The kasha was that we have this asherah tree with a nest at the top. We're saying that the nest is, you could just knock it off and get benefit from it. So Resh Laqish wanted to bring that as a proof that when an Avodah Zarah breaks, it's permitted. That's why the nest is permitted. So the first answer that the Gemara gave was, well, it could be that the twigs didn't necessarily come from the tree itself. It could have been that the twigs came from elsewhere. And that's why they are permitted. But you can argue that if it came from the tree itself, it would be asur. And therefore it's not a kasha in Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Abba gives a different answer. He says, you can even say that the twigs came from the tree itself and still argue that Avodah Zarah is asur. Let's see how. Rabbi Abba, Rabbi Yochanan, ma yatas be'efrochen. You could say, what does it mean that you could knock it down? You can knock down the chicks. You can get benefit from the chicks, but the nest itself, which came from the Asherah, you can't get benefit from. So if Rabbi wanted to bring this as a proof they can get benefit from the nest, if Resh Laqish wanted to bring this as a proof they can get benefit from the nest, and the Asherah is no longer asur, that won't be a proof, because actually you could say, what can you get benefit? Not from the nest, but from the chicks in the nest. Rabbi Yaakov, the Rabbi Yomi by Tachlifa, as Baralach, I will explain to you the efrochin, when it comes to the chicks, kan v'kan mutarin. Kan v'kan, I think, right, ben behektish, ben ba'asher mutarin, tein tzrichen nilam. So by the chicks, whether we're talking about the tree that's hektish, whether we're talking about an asherah tree, you would be able to get benefit from the chicks. And as Rashi explains, because the chicks don't need the tree. Let's go weiter for a second. Bebeitzim, but if we're talking about the eggs that are in, right, that need the nest and that are in the nest, and the nest comes from the tree, kan v'kan asur, and whether we're talking about the hektish tree or the asherah tree, the eggs which need the nest, which comes from the asherah tree, would be asur, or from the hektish tree. Rav Ashi v'afrochen shetzrichen liman kibeitzim damu, and says Rav Ashi that chicks that are dependent on their mother, they are basically in this context would be treated the same as the eggs themselves, and also they would not be allowed because they are dependent on the tree, either the hektish tree or the asherah tree. And now we get to a new mishnah. Motzei kelim v'aleim tzuras chama tzuras levana tzuras daikon. A person finds vessels. He finds vessels, and on these vessels that he finds, there are images of the constellation of the sun or the moon or a dragon. Yolichem liyam hamelech, he goes straight to the Dead Sea and throws them in. He gets rid of them. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, she'ala mechubadin asurin she'ala mevuzin mutarin, says Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, that if these images were on an honorable, a mechubad vessel, and tomorrow we'll talk about what exactly is considered a mechubad vessel, but if these drawings or etchings are on a mechubad vessel, then they're also. But if it's on something not particularly special, so then they would be then they would not be. Also, they would be permitted. It says the Gemara lemeimed lahaniru de palchilu midiacharina lo, by specifying these three items: constellation of the sun, the moon, and a dragon. These are the only things that they worship, not other things. But we have a contradiction. Ashoichet lishum yomim. Lishum naira is a person who slaughters, I guess, an animal for the rivers, or for the seas. Lishum naharos for the rivers. Lishum midbar for the desert. Lishum chama, lishum levana, lishum kochavim, mazalas, for the sun, the moon, stars, constellations. Lishum michal sar gadol, lishum shilshul kain. For Michael, the angel, and for a small little worm. These are Avodah Zarah. So we see that Avodah Zarah could be all sorts of things. Rabbi says, look, they'll worship anything. However, what are they going to etch onto things? And, if they're not going to necessarily etch a little worm. That would be more significant things. That would be something like the sun, the moon, a dragon. These three important things they will draw, and then worship these things that are drawn on these items. But for other things, it would just be some kind of decoration. If you found something with like a worm on it, it's not the kind of thing that they would draw in order to worship it. To draw and worship, that would be limited to the sun, the moon, a dragon. Okay. However, we're going to end here for Daf Mem Beis of Masechta Avodah Zarah. On Daf Mem Beis of Masechta Avodah Zarah, we wrapped up the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Laqish about Avodah Zarah that breaks. Is it Osir, like Rabbi Yochanan says, or is it mutter like Resh Laqish says? We had back and forth, Rabbi Yochanan trying to prove wrong Resh Laqish trying to prove wrong Rabbi Yochanan. And then we got to the next mishnah of our parak about vessels that you find that have images on them, and we will continue with this discussion tomorrow, and we will learn the Gemara on this new mishnah tomorrow until we get to our next mishnah. So I will see you all tomorrow. Cheers.